everybody. Welcome back to CMN 201, and this is for our class for Wednesday, the 21st of October. Where we left off last class was watching Psycho, probably one of the most classic horror films that have ever been made. And in reading the responses to your attendance questions, it seems that all of you, or at least many of you, were great fans of this particular film. Obviously, this film is much more sophisticated than any of the other films that we've seen thus far. Part of that happens to do with the time period that now we are in the 1960s. So cinematic techniques have progressed at that particular point. That said, we're still in a black and white situation, but Psycho, even though it may seem dated, it also seems incredibly contemporary, and I think part of that is because of Alfred Hitchcock, and he was just a master director who began his film career in London. I gave you a few readings on Alfred Hitchcock, known for his TV show and his thrillers, and has oftentimes been called the father of the modern horror film. And I think that that's a accurate title in terms of the kind of significance that Psycho has had. In fact, today we're going to be watching The Night of the Living Dead, and that director, George Romero, has oftentimes been called the father of the zombie tale, or the zombie film, which we will talk about in a bit. One of the things that Alfred Hitchcock was able to show is that nothing was safe, and that isolation only leads to increasing elements of danger. Something that's been hinted at other films, but not done, I don't think, nearly as well. In part because of the authoritative view of the camera. I mean, we really get a sense of being a voyeur with that camera when we see, for instance, the very first scene with Marion Crane and her lover in their hotel room. And this idea of voyeurism is played out when we see Norman himself spying on individuals during very private moments. Now, Alfred Hitchcock had done an incredible number of films prior to Psycho, 46. Psycho is probably his best known film. 3 years after Psycho, he filmed The Birds, and that's also an incredibly powerful horror film as well, but it probably doesn't have the mystique of Psycho, maybe because of that shower scene, which at the time was absolutely stunning for audiences, and what motivated me to ask my attendance question about why you thought that scene was so compelling. And as many of you indicated, first of all, was just the incredible editing and sounds that was done with that particular scene, where audiences will swear that they see the knife penetrate the skin, and that's not the case at all. We see knife and skin, but it's a marvel in editing. And the musical score has become nothing short of iconic, so that with just a few notes you recognize it immediately. The idea that a woman is being murdered so brutally when she's in such an incredibly vulnerable position. She's nude in the shower, perhaps one of the most private places one can be in. And again, illustrating the idea that no place is safe, not even one's own home, not even one's bathroom. Granted, she's not in her own home, she's in a hotel at this particular point in time. But the idea that safety is not something that we can take for granted. We saw this a little bit with Invasion of the Body Snatchers when we're presented with what seems to be the idyllic American dream of suburbia. And then we find out that that dream of suburbia can be easily contaminated. But the contamination, even though we've read it from lots of thematic or symbolic possibilities, ultimately is from space aliens. It's from some sort of outside element. I mean, now the horror is here. It's within neighbors, it's within family, it's within friends, literally. It isn't some sort of a transformation that's occurred through some sort of alien invasion. The budget was rather small, only $800,000, but it was a commercial success for the film. And that shower scene did lead to boycotts and also to censorship, being able to see the blood and the blood going down the drain. And that said, another reason why this film was so surprising is because prior to this point, we thought that Marion Crane was our lead character. So to have the lead character, and she basically had much more of an established career as an actor than Perkins did for his role with Norman Bates. So the assumption was that she was the star, and it turns out that she was not the star at all of the movie. It was going to be Anthony Perkins, and that really helped to cement his career. And also, his career was up and coming, and he was being promoted at that point as a kind of young heartthrob. So to have him cast in the role of a villain was also very surprising to audiences as well. That said, one of the Gothic techniques that I love about Psycho is how the house is presented. And it definitely has all of the Gothic trappings of the haunted house. And the house is very much presented as a piece of monstrosity. And in some ways, too, sort of serves to narrate the story of what happens when we are secluded within the home. Well, we've got a detective story, and if you know anything about Edgar Allan Poe, he's been credited with creating the modern detective story. But detective stories and the genre of something like the Gothic tend to share some similarities. But this detective story definitely has elements of Gothic within it that have inspired other directors, just like John Carpenter of Halloween, which we will talk about as well. And the sense of even the dark humor in this piece, when Norman's mother, so to speak, says, you want to put me with in the basement because you think I'm fruity. You want to put me with the preserves. Is something that I've always appreciated in this particular film, as well as some of the symbolism, and not just of the isolated house, which could be a commentary of what's going on in the 1960s, where we saw some of this in the 1950s, the suburban flight where basically one's home was supposed to be a place of safety, and the family unit was supposed to provide all of the emotional and domestic support. And what happens with that kind of domestic seclusion? Well, you get psychological horror, as we see with the Bates family, as we've got Norman Bates' domineering mother, and how ultimately he ended up killing his mother and her lover, and how he's never really been able to have any kind of meaningful relationship with anyone outside of that family unit. And even the relationships within that family unit were rather distorted. Mental health is obviously an issue that's addressed in this film, hence the name Psycho. Though the mental health understanding of the time was much more simplistic than what we would think about in today's world, without a doubt. But this is the definition, or the explanation, I should say, for Norman Bates' transformation into his mother. Note the doubling here, where we've got Norman Bates and his mother, who are one and the same, and we know that doubles are very common in the world of the Gothic. We've got two stories. First, there's the Marion story, and then there's the Norman story. Marion, who's craving a certain level of respectability, and then she's tempted to steal, and we believe that the money is going to be the main focus of the plot, the theft that she's engaged in, and we find out that that's just a red herring, and the film is something completely different. And even the two sisters, because after Marion is gone, we see her sister, Lila, and that would be perhaps an interesting thing to examine in this particular film, the idea of the doublings right down to the city versus the suburbs. Now, one of the reasons why the suburbs were so important at this time was because of the importance of the car, which led to a certain level of mobility. And it strikes me that the car plays a central piece in this film. After all, Marion goes to buy a new car, and she's spending her time in the highway, and it's because the highway's been built that has secluded basically the Bates Motel, which leads to the story of Norman and his mother, who says quite, I think, adeptly, that there's no purpose in life of leisure. A hobby should pass time, not necessarily fill it, which is the situation that he's in now, where he's alone. And what we will see is that there are all kinds of secrets behind closed doors, and definitely the secrets are many with the Bates Motel. I love the bird symbolism in this film, and it's something Hitchcock is well known for. After all, he even filmed a film entitled The Birds, about nature gone awry, in effect, that might have some rather contemporary significance in today's day. But notice that Marion's last name is Crane. The references to the idea that she's eating like a bird. We have Norman and his taxidermy of various animals, including birds. So this bird image as representation for female is something that we see throughout the piece. Water is something else that we oftentimes see with Alfred Hitchcock, and the redeeming nature of water. When Marion decides to take a shower, for instance, before the iconic shower scene, she's made a decision, it would seem, that she's going to turn herself in and admit to the theft. But it turns out that water can't completely redeem her. And certainly we see how Norman tries to clean up after the fact and bury the car in water, but again, sins come to the surface. They don't necessarily remain buried. So those are just a few of the things that we could think of in relation to Psycho. But I wanted to talk a little bit about Night of the Living Dead as well, because I've done a little bit of cheating. Each of the films were supposed to represent a particular decade. And now I've got Psycho as representative of the 1960s, suggestive of the idea that it might be an examination of perhaps some of the sexual liberation that was going on during the time period, that a woman could be more sexually active, and some of the backlash associated with that when we see how Norman responds to sexuality. It could also be a representation of the suburbs not necessarily being a safe place. The idea of where we've got a generation who oftentimes would rely on things like tranquilizers and alcohol in order to numb their psychosis or their pain. And that would all work great with Psycho, but yet we've also got Night of the Living Dead, which is also an incredibly iconic horror film that also occurred in the 1960s. So I felt that for the decade of the 60s, I had to cheat a little bit and show you two films. And while I'm not necessarily done talking about the 1960s in relation to Psycho, I wanted to anticipate the 1960s in terms of Night of the Living Dead. A decade that was definitely filled with conflict and fear. There was a lot of political and social upheaval that was going on during the time period that may not necessarily be as noticeable in Psycho, but it would definitely be noticeable in Night of the Living Dead. And in fact, George Romero had mentioned that in some of his interviews about his film, that he was well aware of some of the political and social tensions that were going on during his time period, and he wanted to illustrate that metaphorically through the use of his zombies, but also through the use of the survivors. Now, prior to this film, the zombie film was usually associated with Haitian voodoo, and there was an ability to transform somebody through voodoo and also through chemical means, chemical potion. Probably some of the poison from a pufferfish, actually, is what some research has revealed, to create what was known as a zombie, that basically someone would appear to be dead and then they would be buried, and it would turn out that they were not dead, and then they would either rise from the grave, so you can get the idea of where Romero got perhaps some of his contemporary ideas about zombies, or they might have been dug up from the grave, and they would have lost most of their consciousness, but would have still been physically alive, so they would have been perfect for slave labor, and that's exactly how they were used at that time. Zombifying someone at the time, also in Haiti, was an opportunity to enact a certain amount of revenge against an enemy. There was even a reference in the penal code of the time that it would be illegal to zombify someone. And that was basically how a zombie was thought of until George Romero came about with his film Night of the Living Dead. And in fact, quite interestingly, with this film, he didn't use the word zombie. The zombie word was only used after reviews came out about the film. He used the word ghoul, which is an entity that is able to resurrect after death. But once the word zombie was used in reviews, that word stuck, and that has become the iconic view of what we think of in terms of a zombie. So if you want to think about some modern day adaptations, things like The Walking Dead, for instance, if you happen to be a fan of the comic book or of the television show, very much based on this idea of what Romero did with the zombie. And in terms of our watching this particular film, it is not difficult to find it online. And this is because of the copyright history associated with this film. This was an independent film, a low budget film, in some ways very different from Psycho, where you've got an established director like Alfred Hitchcock. And while Alfred Hitchcock filmed Psycho on a low budget, Night of the Living Dead was done on a shoestring budget. And when Romero was finally able to sell his film, it turns out that through the entire editorial process, the little copyright sign was left off of the opening credits, which meant that technically this film was not copyrighted. What did that mean for Night of the Living Dead and for zombies? That means anybody could show this film at any time, which means it's readily available on the internet. I try to get you a cleaner copy on the internet with the link that I've provided so that you could see it in a sharper focus, because some of the cinematography, considering the fact that he was working with very rudimentary materials and with very little money, is absolutely outstanding. He filmed it in black and white initially so he could save money. He got an infusion of cash into his project midway through and decided to keep the black and white, which I think was the right choice because it gives it this kind of artistic element that we've been seeing in all of the films thus far. But that means we'll have to wait until the 1970s until we get to a color film. And that lack of copyright has probably led to our being able to think of the zombie as this iconic figure. Because I don't know if Romero's film had been copyrighted, if it would have risen to the level of distinction and viewership that it has. It was because it was shown on late night TV shows all over the place. This was pre-internet, of course. Because it wasn't copyrighted, that everybody had a familiarity, or many people had a familiarity with the zombie tale. Because Night of the Living Dead was not the kind of film that Psycho was, that could appear in feature playhouses. And I think I even mentioned that Hitchcock had a very clever hook to get people to watch the film in playhouses, that the film would not, or the playhouses would not allow audience members into the films after the film had started. So that helped to build, the level of suspense of what is so special about this particular film, that audience members will not be allowed entrance. And there were lots of gimmicky techniques that were going on during this time period to get individuals interested in film, particularly horror film. William Castle is a great example of this. He was very much a showman. Probably one of his most famous films is called The Tingler. And basically what he did was he had theater houses rig up these mechanical devices onto the seats that would deliver small shocks to the audience members whenever on screen this monster called the Tingler was evidenced, so that we could viscerally feel some of what was happening on screen. Or would have skeletons that would be rigged up in the theater that would fly over the audience during appropriate times for the film. So and even issuing things like life insurance policies, and not allowing, or at least offering audiences the option of signing a life insurance policy that if they died of fright during the viewing of the film, they would be entitled to life insurance. So again, all of those gimmicks, right down to having a nurse stand in the hallway in case somebody became overcome with fright, worked very nicely. But I think Hitchcock did it in a much less cheesy way, and did it in a much more Hollywood-esque kind of way. When we get to George Romero, again, he was doing things that were very unique for filmmaking because he wasn't part of the filmmaking establishment. His friends and family basically were the actors. They were able to rent an abandoned farmhouse so that they can film in. And in fact, they were living in that farmhouse while they were filming. So it was, as he calls it, very much a guerrilla filmmaking. So I don't know if that film could have ever reached the status of a Psycho if it had gone through normal channels. So ironically, perhaps not copywriting the film was the best thing that George Romero could have had happen to him, because it meant an incredibly wide viewership. Now, of course, it's negative because Romero didn't get the profits from that particular film. And he and his business partner eventually parted ways. And obviously, the films that proceeded after that, and George Romero is probably best known for his first three zombie films, because after Night of the Living Dead, there's Dawn of the Dead, which is a great commentary on commercialism in society, that basically shoppers are much like zombified individuals who have no sense of agency or thought. And that was done in the 1970s, which would be the heyday of the shopping mall. So that worked very nicely for a commentary for the 70s. And his last film of the 80s, though he did a few films after that, but the first three were probably the best. The film of the 80s, which was Day of the Dead, which was an apocalyptic tale where basically there were a few survivors in a bunker, and it's very reminiscent of some of the fears of nuclear war and the Cold War that were going on in the 1980s as well. But going back to Night of the Living Dead, probably one of the first things that you should know, which we are going to talk about in greater depth later, is that we have a central figure who is African American, which would have been incredibly unusual for this particular time period. Now, according to Romero, he just merely chose the best actor for the job. That actor was not chosen because he was African American, and that role was not written for an African American, but the reality of some of the deeply entrenched racism of the time period made it impossible to ignore. So the film has oftentimes been read as a commentary about African Americans, and even the actor who played the role says that just the mere fact that he was African American completely changes the entire composition of the film because of some of the anxieties going on in society. So those were some of the anxieties that Alfred Hitchcock didn't necessarily touch upon, but were touched upon in Night of the Living Dead, that I hope justifies why we've got two movies representing the 1960s. So what I thought I would do was to let you watch Night of the Living Dead, and then next class we could talk about Night of the Living Dead and put some closure onto Psycho as well as the ending of our 1960s. And I also encourage you to begin thinking more carefully about your final project as we hit about the mid-semester. Believe it or not, time goes quickly. So hopefully you've got some ideas, and feel free to send them to me. We'll spend some more time in class talking about them as well. Now, Night of the Living Dead, the second film from the 1960s, completely shocked audiences. So while Psycho and the shower scene shocked audiences, the film as a whole, Night of the Living Dead, shocked audiences for a whole number of reasons. So I wanted to ask you for today's attendance question is, what do you think shocked viewing audiences the most in the 1960s when they watched Night of the Living Dead, and why? And if you haven't seen this film, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, though I've already suggested that the film is about zombies, and I've already suggested that we've got an African American lead. But there's lots in this film that could be considered to be absolutely shocking for its time period, and maybe even for our contemporary time period. So enjoy Night of the Living Dead. If it's possible to enjoy such a kind of film. But if you enjoy horror films, then you probably will appreciate Night of the Living Dead. That might be a better way of stating it. And I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We'll continue on next class, putting some closure to Night of the Living Dead in the 1960s, and then move forward to the 70s with The Exorcist. I warn you, this is the time where it might get a little bit trickier to be able to find film on the internet that is available to everyone. So as we get into more contemporary films, but if that's the case, I've always got a fallback that I can provide you with the code so that you can access it through Amazon Prime if you're not able to access the film on your own through another venue. It's a little bit cumbersome, but it does work. So, and hopefully we won't have to rely on that too much. And certainly if any of you find any public access versions of the films that are coming up and you wanted to send them my way, that would be lovely. So again, I hope you're well. I'm well, and enjoy Night of the Living Dead.